Yes, the week has been quite one, not the least the fact that the Olympics, the four yearly events of the best of games has started in Paris, and they made a matter of swimming in the, shall we not say, not so healthy River Seine. And the mayor was for wear, as we hear. And it's been, the usual excellence on show, not least the fact that Simone Biles becomes the most decorated gymnast in the history of the Olympics, which is a joy to behold. And yes, the United States almost lost their crown to South Sudan. And again, that comes with its own, how shall I say it, loose tongues, but that's not the matter for today. In fact, we're going to start the story today in Paris, but by way of Algeria. And the first story comes from Paris, and it's Algeria. So, and the first news comes from AP, the Associated Press, and it's titled Algeria Honor Victims of Colonial Era French Crackdown at the Paris Olympic Ceremony. And the lead goes, Algeria reminded France of a particular dark chapter of its colonial past during its otherwise celebratory opening ceremony for the Paris Olympics on Friday. What happened? Algeria brought red roses on their boat as they paraded for the event and then tossed them into the river to honor victims of the infamous 1961 police crackdown on Algeria protesters in Paris. Some of the members chanted "Long live Algeria" in Arabic after throwing the flowers. Historians say some 120 protesters died and 12,000 were arrested as they demonstrated on October 17, 1961 in support of the independence from France, then Algeria's colonial ruler. Some were thrown into the Seine River, which is where the opening ceremony took place. And French authorities sought to cover up the 1961 massacre for decades. French President Emmanuel Macron recently acknowledged that crimes were committed that day, inexcusable for the Republic. It is on record that France won its independence in 1962 after 132 years under colonial rule. Your initial take, comrade.
Okay. Well, it speaks, obviously. I mean, at some point in the article, there was the observation that some people were saying, this is not the right moment for protest. I mean, that's preposterous. When is the right moment to protest? You're supposed to protest at the most inconvenient moment for the authorities.
The key word is the protest.
Regardless, what does a protest mean? If it has to be at an specified time and location, right?
Yeah, then it's not a protest.
It speaks to an era that was, that's a hypocrisy of colonialism. You want to be portrayed as civilized people while you're committing acts of savagery, right? And that is why it is important for you to cover up your lies. So in other words, it is much more important to protect the false image and reputation of you as a civilized people who are not capable of committing barbaric acts, correct?
Correct.
Forget about that massacre alone in Paris, but the War of Liberation itself, the Algerian War of Liberation, how brutal that was in terms of the French scorched earth genocidal approach to suppressing that War of National Liberation. That was also covered up for many, many years. So
Correct?
it's not inconsistent with the cover-up of that massacre of 1961. And
Hmm.
of course, the Algerians did the right thing. They didn't disrupt anything. They just made a very uh, powerful and strong symbolic act without
Correct?
disrupting any of the festivities that accompany the opening ceremony of the Olympics. So it was very measured, relatively low key, but at the same time, just given the coverage that it's getting, quite effective in what they wanted to say. They were not
Yes.
making any demands.
Of
They just
course, of
wanted
course.
the memory of the victims to be honored.
Yeah. I mean, speaking to the Algeria War of Independence, over 1 million people died in the course of the Algeria liberation,
Correct.
as led by the FLN.
Correct.
And
And the Battle of Algiers, as you know,
Mhm.
had been banned in France. Uh, that film is a dramatic reenactment, of course. It's not a documentary. Some young people sometimes confuse it, think it's a documentary. It's a reenactment, but a very powerful one, the Battle of Algiers, um, by Pontecorvo, the Italian filmmaker. That was banned. It could not be shown in France, I think, until late, maybe in the 1970s or so. So it speaks to that same period. You're ashamed and disgusted by your own barbaric deeds,
Hmm.
and yet you go out of your way to try to cover it up.
Hmm. I mean, again, just to buttress the point you were making, that war of independence soured the relationship between France and Algeria up to the point that it was only in 1976 that the French tricolor flag and the national anthem was played on the soil of Algiers or in Algeria. And that was at the visit of the then president, Gaston. Other than that, Algeria wanted nothing to do with France.
And you would not be
Nothing to do with.
surprised, I mean,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
kind of barbaric deeds they committed in trying to hold on to people that wanted their own independence. Just like
Mm.
in Vietnam. In Vietnam, of course, they were taught a lesson at the Great Battle of Dien Bien Phu
Mhm.
in 1954 when they were defeated. And you would think that they learned a lesson in Vietnam. But no, they come back to Algeria and they still want to carry out the same colonial project, which had collapsed in Vietnam.
Well, yeah, it's the thing about their press is when they run these stories, they minimize the historical context.
Yes,
Everything is
absolutely.
taken out.
I agree with you totally.
Yeah. So
And
when
that
they
is
write,
the tragedy
mm,
of Africa and African nations and many of the less industrialized or non-industrialized rather countries. The tragedy of not having media or media outlets or even wired services that have that kind of outreach and impact.
mm, mm,
But at the same
mm,
time, I do not blame anyone except for the African countries themselves. Did
mm.
you expect imperialism to create that media outlet for you? Think about it. We have the resources to buy jet fighters, to buy tanks, armored personnel carriers. I don't know any African country that does not have an air force, even if it's a small one, and a mechanized uh, division
Army. Hmm.
in the armed forces. And you're telling me that you cannot collectively have your own version as powerful as the BBC? That
Mm.
to me is just preposterous. And don't blame anybody except yourselves.
True, 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 true.
The leadership, of course. I mean, you know, the people don't have the kind of resources to do that. They're
Mm.
being overtaxed by the national governments, as we're seeing the protests are now erupting. So I don't expect them at the same time to have the kind of resources to pool and to create international media outlets of that kind of scope. But hopefully, these types of conversations will eventually attract enough Africans that they may have some resources, the ones that may work globally in other spaces.
Yep.
That also have, of course, the correct political orientation. We're not sitting here and saying that there are no wealthy Africans. Of course, there are many wealthy Africans. Some that have made their money correctly, some that have not made their money correctly, but there are wealthy Africans. It's one thing to have the wealth, and then it's the other thing to have the consciousness to realize how important it is to be able to tell the story from your perspective, and that is a challenge, of course.
And for those who want to read more on the Algeria War of Independence, I've drawn out Alistair Horn's A Savage War of Peace, Algeria 1954 to 1962. It's a very old book. You should be able to get it. But it's the only one I know that is written in English, because majority of the other books are in French and Arabic. But again, the name of the book is Alistair Horn's A Savage War of Peace, Algeria 1954 to 1962.